students, this lecture is based on the topic Communication, Concept, Theory, Process. This lecture, first of all, will introduce the topic, then it will deal with the origin of the term communication and the definitions of communication. After that, it will go for a brief discussion on the theory of communication. Then the lecture will focus on the various elements or components of communication which are very significant because they help in the process of communication. So let's begin the discussion. These days in every curriculum we find that the topic communication forms an integral part. We have to understand the reasons behind this. If we start exploring the reasons, we will certainly realize that even if we think beyond the curriculum, we find that communication is a necessary aspect of all our lives. We can't think of a world without communication. Just imagine that you are in a situation or a place or a world devoid of communication. What would you experience? For example, you are hungry, but you are unable to express your hunger. You have an outstanding solution to a problem, but you don't have the power to communicate that. Thus, it's quite unthinkable to have a life or a world without communication. It is an inseparable part of our lives. It is a necessity. Every individual feels the need to express himself or herself, express his or her feelings, thoughts, and ideas. Now let us discuss the origin of the term. If we know the etymology of the word communication, it would certainly help us to understand the basic notion or concept of communication. The word has derived from the Latin word communicare, which means to share, to impart, or to make common. From the origin of the word communication, we get a hint or clue to what the definitions of communication would be. Let's discuss two ideas which would help to define communication. So the very first idea has been taken from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which says communication is a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. It is a verbal or written message. It is a system for transmitting or exchanging information. It is a technique for exploring ideas effectively. It is a connection. Now, the second idea of communication is by J. Pearson and P. Nelson, who in their book An Introduction to Human Communication, Understanding and Sharing claim that communication is the process of understanding and sharing meaning. You can easily point out that in both the ideas, some words have been highlighted. These highlighted words actually reflect on the key terms closely associated and related to communication. The words highlighted in idea 1 are process, information, exchange, system, technique, transmission. The words highlighted in the second idea are process, understanding, sharing, meaning. So if we look very carefully, we will find that the word process is in both the ideas. The word information in idea 1 can be equated with the word meaning in idea 2. Again, the word exchanged in the first idea can be related to the word sharing in the second idea. So, let us discuss the three major words related to the concept of communication. First one is process. So, process means steps or series of events leading towards a result. Second important term is information or meaning, which reflects on set of ideas or explanations. Third important word is exchange or sharing, which means to give something as well as to receive something. Suppose you are at home and your distant relatives come. Your mother introduces you to them. What would you do? Leave the place? No, rather you would start interacting with them. Now, how would you start? By beginning your conversation on the issue of climate crisis? Perhaps no. You would greet them, say good evening or good morning, hello or namaste or doing an adab. Then want to know how they are doing. From this situation, it can be understood that to communicate, you have to follow certain steps, you have to follow certain process. Second thing, now you know that communication is always needed. But the question arises, what to communicate? Here comes the importance of information. And we know now that information is a set of ideas or explanation. Third factor, you have the information ready with you. The activity needed to provide the information to some other person is exchanging or sharing. Right? So communication involves these three important steps. First there is a process, then you must have some information, and third, if you have the information, you need to share it, you need to exchange it. Okay? After this, a second question arises, how to communicate? So, it may be in a written format, it may be in a spoken or oral format, or you can follow some gestures. Right? So, from this discussion, a general definition of communication can be formed. What is that? Communication is a systematic process by which information can be shared or exchanged. It can be done through spoken or written format as well as by using some gestures. So after the discussion on the origin and the definitions of communication, let us now discuss very briefly on the theory of communication. So after all such discussions, a question may arise, is the process of communication only meant for human beings? Let's analyze a situation first. So just imagine you have a pet, maybe a parrot. It loves to eat soaked grass or chickpeas, you may say. So one day you want to give your parrot his favorite food, and you see that whenever you take the chickpeas near it, the parrot moves away and does not eat. You decide to put all the chickpeas on its bowl, and after some time you see that it had not taken a single chickpea. You realize something is wrong. Maybe the bird is unwell, and you decide to contact a vet. So now what do you feel? Want to communicate? Yes, it was actually, although it cannot speak. Similarly, when for some days you don't water your rose plants, you find the leaves drying and turning brown. You understand that they need water. So the reason for explaining to you all these is that these would help you to understand the theory of communication. So the person who propounded this theory of communication is S.F. Scudder, who in the 1980s wrote a book called Communication Theory as a Universal Law. It is in this book where he developed this theory of communication. So in this book, Scudder puts forward the idea that all living entities, beings and creatures communicate. Let us now discuss the framework to the theory of communication. So we'll be discussing 5 basic viewpoints that are included in the theory of communication as explained by S.F. Scudder. So the 5 viewpoints that we are going to discuss are mechanistic viewpoint, psychological viewpoint, systemic viewpoint, critical viewpoint, and finally social constructionist viewpoint. So what is mechanistic viewpoint? According to this viewpoint, transfer or transmission of information from one to another person is called communication. The second viewpoint, that is the psychological viewpoint, adds to the first point, saying that it is not solely the mechanical transformation of information, but it also contains emotions, feelings, and reactions. The third viewpoint, that is the systemic viewpoint, focuses on how meaning of a specific information is perceived or understood. It tries to focus on how much of the real information is changed and why. Because different people have different ways of interpretation. The fourth viewpoint, that is the critical viewpoint, says communication is a process of reflecting how powerful, how authoritative one is. The last viewpoint is the social constructionist viewpoint. It judges the sharing of the views between sender and receiver. This view tries to analyze how someone shares the information, as the way of sharing determines the meaning. So, after this brief discussion on the theory or the framework to the theory of communication, we'll be discussing about the components or elements of communication. To understand the process of communication, first of all, the components or elements involved should be known. So the first element that we are going to discuss is sender or source. So sender, what is it? It is the entity which thinks, creates, and then sends the message. He or she is the conveyor of the message. He or she actively participates in sharing the message or information. It is him or her who involves in the process of encoding, which means the sender tries to select the perfect words, phrases, and then arranges them in a proper sequence and finally shares the message. Now let us come to the second component or element of communication, that is message. S. MacLean, in his book The Basics of Interpersonal Communication, says the message is the stimulus or meaning produced by the source or the sender for the receiver or audience. So depending on the target receiver or the target audience, message may be in the spoken or the written format. A clear and carefully constructed message makes the process of communication easier. Now the third important element, that is the channel. Channel is like a pathway through which the message or information travels from the source or the sender to the receiver and vice versa. It can also be considered as the medium of communication. One can share the message using the oral written medium, for example, face-to-face conversation, telephonic conversation, video conference. These are all the oral medium. And letters, notices, emails, reports, these are all written medium. Now, the fourth element, that is receiver. The receiver is someone who receives the message shared by the sender or the source. He or she, after receiving the message, analyzes, interprets, and finally understands it. This process can be called the process of decoding. Now comes the fifth element, that is feedback. Feedback, we can say, is a kind of response. We can also consider it to be a message from the receiver's side. It can also be in spoken, written, or gestural format. Feedback from the receiver allows the source or sender to realize that the message had been received by the receiver. Not only that, feedback enables the sender to understand whether the message was understood properly or not. For example, as a teacher, you message your students that class tests tomorrow on Unit 1 of the syllabus. Some students replied, "Thank you, teacher, for the information." Some other students replied, "Thank you, teacher. May I know the time of the test?" From the above example of feedback, it gets clear that a certain number of students have understood your message and a certain of students have not only understood but further queries to clarify their doubts. Thus, feedback is not only beneficial for the sender but also for the receiver, as he or she gets a chance to ask for clarification. Now come to the sixth important element of communication, which is the context. Context signifies the setting of communication, the circumstances in which the communication takes place. Let us discuss some examples to understand the meaning and significance of the context of communication. First one, every activity needs a specific time and place. Here comes the relevance of physical context. For example, you are the teacher of class 6 and as they are young, they make a lot of noise inside the class. So you have to shout at them every moment to keep control over them. Now, if you do the same thing while you are with your friends enjoying a campfire, what will happen? Your friends would have a different reaction definitely. So the second example. Second example reflects on the social context. So as part of the society, we follow certain societal norms. That's why communication pattern changes according to different social context. For example, the way you talk to your parents can't be the same way you talk to the principal of your college. Then the third one, that is psychological context. It signifies the emotional aspect of both the sender and the receiver. For example, you start talking about your project to your mother who has just returned from her office. What will happen? She won't be able to listen and respond to you properly because she is tired. Right? After a day's work, she is very tired. So this reflects on the psychological context. Now let us come to the last element of or component of communication, that is interference or noise. It refers to the obstacles or barriers that make the communication process difficult. Noise is one such element. There may be other modes of interferences, okay, but we'll have a detailed discussion on this later on in the upcoming lectures. Now, to see the image that the lecture displays, this image is on the very process of communication. So, we had already focused on the important elements of communication which are involved in the process of communication. So, from the diagram, you can well understand that there should be a source who would encode a message, then he would select a proper channel to deliver that particular message or share particular message, right? And finally, you see that the receiver receives the message, and the very first duty after receiving the message is to decode the message, right? Decoding means to understand, to interpret what the sender needs to say. So the receiver decodes the message, and after that, his or her duty is not over. He or she needs to send a feedback to the source or the sender that she or he has received the message, understood the message as well. And also, we now know that feedback also gives a chance to the receiver to claim for clarification regarding the message or the information shared by the source or the sender. So this is how we need to understand the process of communication. So if we realize the important elements of communication, if we know the concepts of the elements involved in the process of communication, then the process would be very much clear to us. Thank you so much. Hope you understood the topic very well. Please feel free to post your queries in the comment section, and subscribe to our channel, like and share as well. Have a good day.